Okay, so welcome to topic 3 of the HCI module, and in this topic I'm going to talk about different kinds of evaluation of interactive systems. So first of all, I'll talk about two ways of thinking about evaluations, formative and summative, and then I'll talk about expert, analytic, and user-based evaluations. And then I'll introduce a particular kind of evaluation, expert evaluation, and talk about both how we do it and why we use that kind of evaluation. So, thinking back to the user-centered design life cycle that I introduced in topic 1, once you have some designs, you've done some user requirements, you want to start trying out those designs with users before you put a lot of effort into implementing a full system. So we call this type of evaluation formative evaluation. And in fact, the borderline between establishing user requirements and early formative evaluation is rather blurred. So some of the techniques that you learned about in topic 2 could be thought of as formative evaluations or user requirements establishment. So don't worry about that. And sometimes, particularly if you're trying out something new, you want to have something concrete to show to users for them to try out a little bit in a very rough prototype right from the beginning. So we could think of that as formative evaluation, or we could think of it as user requirements. And just to reiterate what I said in topic 1, you might do a number of formative evaluations, trying out different things, deciding something doesn't work with users, trying out something else, or just trying out some of the system with users, and then trying out something else in another evaluation. So I think people do find it a bit confusing because you've got a range of methods like interviews, focus groups, showing people prototypes, getting them to do affinity diagrams, and these methods can be used in different ways at different stages of the user-centered life cycle depending on what you're trying to do. So I try and think of it as a toolkit of methods that help me answer different questions that I might have in different stages of the development. And then the contrast to that is that when you've got pretty much a full system, it may still be in prototype, but you've got a full design, you can test it with users, and we tend to call that a summative evaluation. And again, that can be from something in the lab out to a field trial where you really put something out in the real world to see how people use it. And we'll talk about summative evaluations and user evaluations in general in topic 5. However, although we really emphasize working with users very closely, involving them, making them the center of user-centered design or human-centered design. And we think of user evaluation, meaning evaluation with potential users, as a gold standard. It's often referred to as the gold standard. But there are other kinds of evaluations that can be very useful and have their place in the development of interactive systems. So there are different ways of thinking about this, but we tend to think about three kinds of evaluations in terms of who's doing it and who's involved, I suppose. So there's user-based evaluations, which we've talked about and are obviously with users. There are what are called expert evaluations, where instead of getting real users, as we sometimes call them, you get usability experts or user experience experts who use their knowledge and will go through a system and try and predict what kinds of problems the people for whom this system is being developed are going to have with it at this stage, so you can work on those problems. And I often like to do that because I don't want to waste my users' time and give a bad impression to my users that the system isn't very good yet. I like to think of it as getting rid of the main usability problems before I do a summative evaluation with users. Although users always do unexpected things, so you still need user evaluations, but I like to do both expert and user evaluations. And then there's another kind of analysis, sometimes called an analytic evaluation, but it's another tool in the toolbox of an HCI or a user experience person. And these are analytic methods where you look at how tasks are structured, current tasks, why are they not working, or how would we structure the new task. And it's not quite the same as a flow diagram. We'll come to that in the next topic. Also, sometimes when people talk about evaluation, they think of something else, which is not really done in HCI very much. It could be done occasionally, and that's what I'd call a feature or a function evaluation. So sometimes when, if you're buying a new washing machine, for example, and you would compare what are the different features that they have, and sometimes you'll get user ratings on Amazon, or if you read a magazine like Which, they'll do tests. So yes, it is evaluating, but it's evaluating the functionality, which could be part of usability in terms of the effectiveness, but we tend not to do that very much because we don't tend to have a lot of products that we're comparing. So just to kind of situate our evaluations with that kind of evaluation. So I'm now going to talk about expert evaluations, and I think these are an important part of our work, although they're sometimes a bit misrepresented, but they can be a useful and very efficient way of finding some of the usability problems and improving how well a system's going to work. And I think that's partly because if you as the HCI person or the user experience person are very closely involved in the development, you know what the system can do and how it does it. And it can be hard to stand back and think, well, will the target users really understand this? So you get other HCI people or user experience people to do an independent expert evaluation. And I'm going to talk about two methods of expert evaluation. There are quite a few, and there are different terms floating around, but I'm going to talk about the most famous method, heuristic evaluation, and then a variation of that which I developed with one of my students. And you need to be a bit careful here because people will think that an expert evaluation is just getting some highly paid consultant in to have a bit of a look at your system. And highly paid consultants will be quite prepared to do that. But actually, a good expert evaluation is quite a rigorous method which should give you useful information. And then in the next topic, I'll talk about analytic evaluation. So, as I said, the most famous, very widely used, although often misused, expert method is called heuristic evaluation. It does have something of a poor reputation in HCI circles. That's partly because it's often not done properly, so I'll describe how you do it properly. I think it also has a poor reputation because Jakob Nielsen, whom I think you've heard of before, friend of Don Millman and now colleague of Don Millman, he promoted it as a discount usability method, and he made very strong claims that this would show you in effect all the usability problems that you needed to do and that you didn't need to do user evaluation. I think in actual fact that's a bit misrepresenting what Nielsen really said. And it's definitely not the case because, as I say, I think it has an important and useful role in our work. So, what is it? So, in heuristic evaluation, you recruit 3 to 5 usability experts, and you give them not only your prototype system. I mean, you can do this early on with paper prototypes, low fidelity prototypes, or you can do it towards the end of the development when you've got a full working or worked out system before you go to a summative evaluation. I mean, then if you find problems, you're going to have to redevelop. So the earlier the better once you understand the design. So you give the experts the system. You also give them appropriate explanatory material like personas and what are the scenarios of use, how are people expected to use this system, what tasks should they be undertaking, what goals should they try and achieve. And firstly, you send your experts off. I mean, they can do it in their office or your office or whatever, but they go through your system in private, as it were, individually, and they use a set of heuristics or principles of good interface design, and I'll come back to that, and they use their knowledge. Now, in practice, I found most usability experts who do this, and I've done quite a bit of it, rely more on their knowledge than the heuristics. But the heuristics are very good when you're learning to do it. So they will go through trying out tasks, looking at the interactive system, and come up with a list of what they think the usability problems are, i.e. where will the system not work well for people. Then you get them all together in a group session, and so each of them will have their list of the problems they've identified, and you get them to create a unified list of problems. So there might be some debate of someone saying, well, I think this is a problem, and another person saying, oh no, the users will get that. And they are asked to create a rating for each problem of how severe or important it is. And Nielsen, and indeed with his colleague Mollick, came up with this kind of set of criteria of catastrophic problems where the users won't be able to continue, and this is really important to fix, major problems, minor problems, and cosmetic problems. So they're the rating, and then the heuristics. So the heuristics, the idea is that these are not kind of hard and fast rules, but general principles, guiding principles of what a good interactive system should be like, that are easy to remember and relatively simple. So Nielsen and Mollick came up with a set of heuristics. Now, they came up with these heuristics in about 1990, based on a lot of work they'd done in evaluating systems through the 80s. And one of the problems is that systems are very different, very much more complicated and sophisticated than the ones they were looking at. But these heuristics are still quite widely used, and so you have to take them with a bit of a dose of salt. That sometimes I find the headline is quite good, but the examples are really old-fashioned, and a couple of them are just full old-fashioned. So let me give you a couple of examples of ones which I do find useful and I use, and there's a handout for you with the full set, and you can try out using them in an exercise. So the first heuristic in the Nielsen set is visibility of system status. So I think that's a bit obscure, but what that means is the system should always tell you what is going on, what state it's in, what has it done. So this is actually about the gulf of evaluation. Is the system informing you about what it's done in relation to your input, or what it's expecting from you? So it goes on to say, through appropriate feedback within reasonable time. When they were developing these heuristics, timing of interaction was still pretty much an important consideration, when it's really not so much anymore. And their second heuristic is there should be a match between the system and the real world. And the first part of that, I think, is really important. The system should speak the user's language. Although we are all becoming more digitally literate and used to the way computers work, you should really try and speak the user's language in terms of particularly in terms of the task they're trying to do. So you may remember in topic 1 I had the example of the library system I was evaluating a couple of weeks ago, and they talked about searching in a record. Well, that's the library speak, the way the librarians think about it, whereas we were trying to help them come up with, well, what would students think about as their main market? As it's searching within a book or an item. So and they interestingly, they agreed with me when I went over the findings of our evaluation, that on a number of points they had fallen back into library speak, and they need to think about how do the students think about these things and talk about these things. And also, I like the second part of this match between the system and the real world. Follow real world conventions, making information appear in a natural and logical order. So, going back to the train toilet example, the fact that you have to use the buttons from right to left is not a logical and natural order for speakers of most European languages and many other languages. And some of the big successes in the digital world, like Amazon and eBay, modeled themselves on real world interactions. So Amazon were the ones to start the idea of a digital shopping basket and wish lists and things like that. So you're building on people's real world knowledge. And then number 4, so I can't remember what number 3 is, you can read about that, but I particularly like number 4, is use consistency and standards. So make things consistent, put the same thing in the same place on different screens or web pages, use the same word. Sometimes you have websites, and sometimes it says next, and sometimes it says follow on or whatever. So that just it may not deeply confuse users, but they have to stop and think, is that the same as that? And also, one of the things that has made our lives a lot easier, although it's not perfect yet, is different platforms have developed conventions of how you indicate certain things. The trouble is we have the Windows world and the Macintosh world, and now we have the web world, and now we have mobile apps. So these conventions are constantly evolving, but if there are conventions, it's probably a good idea to follow them. So as I say, that's just a few of the ones that I do still find very useful and I use all the time. So, heuristic evaluation can be useful, but having done a lot of heuristic evaluations myself, both at the university and in consultancy, to be honest, doing heuristic evaluation can be quite boring and frustrating for the experts, because you often have quite a poor system that you're frustrated by, and you're trying to log all the problems that you're finding. And the other thing is, we realize that people often miss out that group discussion in heuristic evaluation, where you bring all the experts together and get them to have a group discussion, and then they might change their minds and learn things from each other. And that adds to the cost. You've got to bring the experts together. So people often only do the first part of heuristic evaluation, which I know from talking to Nielsen and Mollick, they think is very bad. They think that group discussion is really vital. So I thought, well, why not have the group discussion right from the beginning, because it's more interesting, and the experts then have ideas bouncing off each other, and you see a problem that you hadn't thought of that someone else points out, and you think, oh yeah, that's interesting. So we developed the idea of a collaborative heuristic evaluation, because the experts are now collaborating right from the start, and we call that CHE. I am trying to think of a new evaluation method that I can call Fidel, but I haven't come up with that yet. So it's not that different, but there's one key point that we wanted to address. So again, you recruit 3 to 5 usability or user experience experts. One of the nice things about this collaborative method is that because they're all working together, you could have people who are experts in different parts of what it's all about. So if you were evaluating a statistics package, for example, you might have someone who is actually more of a statistician than a usability expert, who would then be commenting on what this is like for a serious statistician. So you can have a mix of experts with different expertises. As before, you give them the system and the personas and the scenarios, the information about what the system's about. But now they start off together as a group. Again, you can give them heuristics, and they use their knowledge, and they go through the system. What we find works well is that one expert drives the system. They actually interact with the system. The others can ask for things to happen. Well, what happens if you press that button there? Type of thing. That's also very useful if you have a complex system that's a working system. One of the experts may need to invest some time before this group evaluation session in understanding basically how the system works and where things are in the system. We have done it where we have the developer who drives the system and we ask questions. You need to be pretty robust, thick-skinned as a developer, because discussion will be quite heated and people will be describing problems. You'll see there's a twist in the tale here, and I have had some rather upset-looking developers in my office. So be careful about that. So the interesting twist is that you want each expert to give their opinion on how important or how severe the problems are. You don't want just group think about how important the problem is. So what we do is that anyone can anyone can suggest a problem, and you agree what the description of the problem is. And that can sometimes be quite tricky because things interact and different people like to describe problems at different levels of abstraction. But you have to agree this is the nature of the problem, and that is public to all the experts. We usually have two screens actually going, one with the interactive system and one with a spreadsheet open, and I will give you that spreadsheet where we log the problem descriptions. And then the experts each have a separate spreadsheet or just a piece of paper, and they privately write their rating of how severe the problem is. We like to use a slightly different rating from Nielsen's, because we find those 4 steps a bit odd. So we just rate on a scale from 1, a very minor problem, through to 5, a very major problem. And in fact, part of the reason for that was I did an evaluation a few years ago with an Italian company, and their prototype interactive system was really just awful. And we were still using the Nielsen rating scale at that point, although we were thinking about this new one. So we sent off the evaluation results to Italy, and we had a very frosty telco with them, and eventually they said, how dare you describe our system as having 10 catastrophic problems. So we realize that's actually quite rude to developers who've probably put a lot of effort, even if it's been misguided effort, into developing the system. So we thought, right, we're going to change. We're just going to use a 1 to 5 scale, and we're going to say very minor to very major. It seems a little bit more polite. And sorry, to go back, everyone rates the problem privately. Now, it could be, and this happens not that often, but relatively often, that one evaluator might think, well, this isn't really a problem at all. I think the users will understand this. Whereas someone else might think, oh, well, I think this is pretty major. I'm going to give it a 4. So then you don't reveal initially your ratings to each other, and the expert who thinks it's not a problem simply gives it a rating of 0. So you go through the interface. The other thing that's interesting is that because we're all usability and user experience experts doing this, we tend to immediately start redesigning the system. So we'll say, oh, well, that's not going to be clear. They should put it over here, or they should put it in a different color, or that may or may not be part of what you're being asked to do. So particularly if you're doing this in industry, but also at the university, I've had the situation where I've been asked to evaluate systems, and I've been told, we just want to know the problems, so we will, in effect, don't tell us how to redesign it. Which I think, well, I do have that expertise as well, but if that's what you want, so you need to establish what's the nature of the brief. Do people just need to know what's wrong, and then they'll redesign it, or do they want help in redesigning it? So you go through the system, you either run out of time or steam, or you come to the end of the system, and now you've got a list of the problem descriptions you've all agreed on and your private ratings. So at that point you can reveal your ratings to each other. And you can have some discussion if your ratings, particularly if they've differed a lot, or particularly if one expert has thought something's not a problem and the others think it a problem, you might want to resolve that. But the good thing is that usually we find within about 2 hours we have a list of problems with an agreed rating, or we take the mean of the ratings, and that can then immediately be fed back to the developers, either in terms of report, or often we then get the developers in and we go through what we've done, explaining the problems. So it is more efficient than the classic heuristic evaluation. And if you're actually paying people, you've only had to pay people for 2 hours, whereas with heuristic evaluation you probably have to pay them for 2 hours to go through the interactive system by themselves. It's interesting. I keep wanting to say interface because heuristic evaluation is kind of old school now when we talked about interfaces. Yes, you would have had to pay each expert for 2 hours of their time to do the solo run through, and then probably another hour or 2 hours to do the group discussion. There are actually other sets of heuristics. After Nielsen published his heuristics, quite a lot of people then came up with heuristics for particular contexts. So there were e-learning heuristics and heuristics for older people and heuristics for systems for children. But these tended to be just taking Nielsen's heuristics and thinking about how would consistency apply in e-learning or in systems for children, and coming up with examples and possibly adding more information that had been gleaned from the literature. So I've never been terribly impressed by those. So a few years ago, with one of my colleagues, we thought, well, okay, Nielsen's heuristics have really been very useful to people, but systems are very different now, and a lot of what we're evaluating is very interactive websites. It's interesting, this was it was when mobile apps were coming to the fore, but we did this on interactive websites. So we had 30 users evaluate 6 highly interactive government websites. This was actually paid for by the government. Each website was evaluated by 15 people, and we analyzed all the usability problems that they had. We ended up with a pool of 935 usability problems, so you could see these 6 websites had quite a lot of problems. And then we looked at which were the most common problems, and we turned them into a set of heuristics, which I think is still reasonably useful for interactive websites, even though the world is constantly changing. And the paper where we describe all that and the heuristics will be available to you, so you can try the Nielsen ones, you can try the Petrie and Power ones as well if you like. And if you're interested, there was about 43% of the heuristics we came up with were new, and we tried to make better organization because we had more heuristics. The one thing I think it was interesting, and we didn't unfortunately notice until after we published the paper, is that we miss out consistency. That didn't come up as a common problem, but I do think it's very important. So I always say to people, yes, please use my heuristics because I put a lot of work into them, but add consistency from Nielsen, because I think that's important. The other thing is there are a number of key people in HCI who have come up with different principles, again trying to distill what it is makes a good interactive system, particularly Ben Schneiderman, another big name in HCI. So he has the 8 golden rules of interface design, and there's a guy who goes by the name of Tog. I think he worked for Apple for a while. He's got his principles of interaction design. So some people use these instead of heuristics, and you can do that as guiding principles. So the idea is you sit there looking at the interactive system and the heuristics. Nielsen, I think, originally said you should go through each heuristic on each screen. I think that's a bit obsessive, but you have them in your mind. So that's another way of doing heuristic evaluation, which is totally legitimate. So there you are, that's it. There's an exercise for you to try a little bit of Che or heuristic evaluation, or a bit of both. There's some reading and some resources. Nielsen's got all his stuff about heuristic evaluation on his website. So you can now try an expert evaluation method in HCI. So good luck with that.